Before history was written in books, it was written in symbols. Not symbols as decoration, but as a language, a precise system, a method of encoding ideas too large, too complex, or perhaps too dangerous to be spoken directly. Across ancient Egypt, Greece, India, and beyond, the same patterns begin to emerge. Temples aligned to the stars, numbers repeated in architecture, stories that mirror each other across continents that were never meant to touch. It gives the impression that something was being preserved, not invented, not imagined, preserved. And those who preserved it did not call themselves philosophers or priests in the way we understand today. They were initiates, individuals who had passed through systems of knowledge that were deliberately hidden from the general population, not because the knowledge was fragile, but because it required preparation to understand. This is where the idea of the mysteries begins, not mysteries as in unsolved questions, but mysteries as in structured teachings. The word itself has been diluted over time. Today a mystery is something unknown, something to be solved, something that exists temporarily in the absence of information. But in the ancient world, the mysteries were never meant to be solved. They were meant to be experienced. They were systems of initiation, carefully constructed environments where knowledge was not simply given, but revealed in stages, not through explanation, but through exposure, through symbol, ritual, and transformation. To enter these systems you did not apply. You were selected, observed, and tested, not for intelligence, but for readiness, because what was being taught was not information in the modern sense. It was a way of seeing, and once seen it could not be unseen. This is why the teachings were hidden, not out of elitism, but out of necessity, because without preparation the symbols would appear meaningless, the rituals would seem theatrical, the entire structure would collapse into superstition, but to the initiate, it was the opposite. Everything was precise. Every gesture, every image, every number carried weight. Nothing was accidental. And across different cultures separated by time and geography, these systems begin to resemble each other in ways that are difficult to ignore. Different names, different gods, different languages, but the same underlying structure, which raises a question that lingers beneath all of it. Were these systems developed independently or remembered? To understand what the mysteries were, you have to strip away the modern instinct to explain everything too quickly. These systems were not lectures. They were not texts to be studied in isolation. They were environments designed to change the individual moving through them. In places like ancient Egypt, Greece, and later Rome, the mystery schools operated as controlled spaces where perception itself was challenged. Initiates were led through sequences of symbolic events, often in darkness, often in silence, sometimes in states deliberately altered through fasting, isolation, or sensory manipulation. What they encountered inside these spaces was not presented as fact, but as experience. Images appeared before them, sounds echoed in chambers built with impossible acoustics. Rituals unfolded with precise choreography, each movement carrying meaning that could not be explained in words alone. The purpose was not to tell the initiate what reality was. The purpose was to destabilize their existing understanding of it. Because the assumption underlying all mystery traditions was simple but radical, that what most people call reality is only a surface layer, a constructed perception, a set of patterns accepted without question, because they are familiar. And beneath that surface there exists a deeper structure, one that can be recognized, but only after the individual has been prepared to see it. This is why symbols were used instead of direct statements, A symbol does not give you an answer. It forces you into a relationship with it. It lingers. It repeats. It begins to reveal different meanings depending on the state of the person observing it. And over time that relationship changes the observer. This is the foundation of the mysteries, not knowledge as something you collect, but knowledge as something that reshapes you. Within these systems, nothing was ever presented at face value. Every layer concealed another, and every answer led deeper into the structure rather than out of it. What appears at first glance to be mythology begins to shift under closer attention. The stories are not simply narratives about gods and heroes. They are frameworks, encoded sequences that mirror processes occurring within the individual. A descent into the underworld is not just a journey through a physical realm. It becomes a movement inward, a confrontation with what is hidden, suppressed, or unrecognized. A death within these stories is rarely final. It marks a transition, a dissolution of one state into another, and rebirth is not presented as a miracle, but as a consequence, something that follows naturally once a certain threshold has been crossed. These patterns repeat with such consistency across cultures that they begin to feel less like invention and more like observation, as though different civilizations were describing the same internal process, using the symbolic language available to them at the time. In the mystery traditions, these stories were not told for entertainment. They were enacted. Initiates did not simply hear about descent, death and rebirth. They moved through symbolic versions of these processes within the initiation itself. Darkened chambers became underworlds. Silence became isolation. The loss of orientation became a form of symbolic death. And then, at a precise moment, something would shift. Light would return. Sound would reappear. The initiate would be guided back not as the same person who entered, but as someone who had passed through a structured transformation. This is what separates the mysteries from philosophy or religion in the modern sense. They were not systems of belief, they were systems of experience. When viewed from the outside, these practices can seem theatrical, even excessive. Robes, symbols, hidden chambers, staged ordeals. It is easy to dismiss them as elaborate performances designed to impress or control, but that interpretation misses the function entirely. Every element within the mystery systems was designed to bypass the ordinary way the mind processes information, not by overwhelming it, but by redirecting it, by placing the individual into situations where familiar reference points no longer applied. In that state, something unusual happens. The mind, no longer anchored to its usual patterns, begins to reorganize. It becomes more receptive, more aware of subtle connections it would normally ignore. Patterns begin to emerge where none were seen before. This is why the environments were so controlled. Light was used deliberately. Darkness was not an absence, but a tool. Sound was shaped within spaces that amplified or distorted it in precise ways. Even movement was choreographed to guide attention without the initiate fully realizing it. Nothing was random, and more importantly, nothing was explained in the moment. Explanation would have reduced the experience to something conceptual, something that could be accepted or rejected too easily. Instead, the initiate was left to move through the sequence without certainty, without clear instruction, forced to engage directly with what was happening. This created a kind of internal tension, a gap between what was expected and what was experienced, and within that gap, new understanding could begin to form, not as something imposed from the outside, but as something discovered internally. This is why the mysteries relied so heavily on symbol and ritual, because both operate in a way that language cannot. They do not tell you what something means. They place you in a position where meaning begins to reveal itself. If you follow this pattern far enough, a larger structure begins to take shape. Different cultures, different eras, different names, yet the same underlying approach repeats. Knowledge is not handed over directly. It is concealed, layered, and revealed through experience. Symbols are used instead of statements. Transformation is prioritized over explanation. It suggests that these systems were not isolated inventions. They were expressions of a shared understanding about how human perception works. That to truly grasp something fundamental, it cannot be given in its final form. It has to be encountered, questioned, and gradually recognized. This is why the mysteries were always described as something to be entered, not something to be read. And it is also why they were often protected so carefully, not because they were fragile, but because they could be misunderstood. Stripped of their structure, the symbols lose their function, the rituals lose their meaning. What remains looks like fragments, pieces without context. But when the structure is intact, those same fragments begin to align, patterns repeat, ideas reinforce each other, and something more coherent starts to emerge beneath the surface. Not a single doctrine, not a fixed belief system, but a way of seeing. And once that way of seeing begins to take hold, it changes how everything else is interpreted. This is the foundation the rest of these teachings are built on. Not answers, but a framework. Not conclusions, but a system that reshapes how conclusions are reached.